Thank you for that wonderful welcome. And this has been a great way to start my day. I wish I could have been here yesterday. I was teaching. But so I just wanted to thank you all. Do you have my slides to load, or can I share them myself?
Share them yourself.
It says the host is disabled participant screen sharing.
You should be good now.
Okay, I'm good now. All right.
Yeah.
All right, let's see if that works. Did that work? Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here this morning. I just wanted to start by saying it's a real honor to be invited to speak to all of you today. I'm coming to you right now from Mississauga, Anishinaabe territory, also long home to the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples. I myself am a settler of Doukhobor, Norwegian and German descent. Now, the title of my talk today is actually taken from a paper I co-authored with Dr. Tracy Galloway, who many of you might know, especially because she actually presented at this conference yesterday. And honestly, right now, I kind of wish that I had the foresight to have us both presenting together right now. Tracy is very much the expert when it comes to talking about contemporary health issues. And while I'll do my best to do justice to our collaborative work, my role in our research was very much that of a historian. And so I'm really going to focus my remarks today on the history of residential schooling, particularly, and specifically on a series of nutrition experiments conducted in 6 residential schools across the country during the late 1940s and early 1950s. So I should warn in advance, this is a very triggering topic, and just, be careful with yourself. It's difficult things to hear. And I do also want to apologize in advance. I'm getting over a cold, and so I'm going to sound very froggy for this entire presentation. But I'll do my best to get through. And really my goal today is to look at what the story of these nutrition experiments can teach us about the health impacts of residential schools more broadly, particularly in related to diet-related disease like type 2 diabetes. Now, before I start talking about these nutrition experiments, though, I want to bring us back to the fall of 1965, when the Indian Affairs Branch asked a number of its Indigenous employees to reflect on their experiences as former residential school students. Now, one of these employees was Russell Moses, an Air Force veteran, a member of the Delaware Band of the Six Nations of Grand River here in Ontario. And between 1942 and 1947, Moses had attended what many of you might know as the Mush Hole, the name that Moses and other students used to refer to the notorious Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. And here's a picture of the Mohawk Institute. Now, this residential school had opened in the 1830s as one of Canada's first Indian residential schools, and it would remain open or remain in operation until 1970, so the longest running residential school as well. Now, Moses was blunt in his assessment of his residential school experience. And this is a photo of Moses and his sister, just as a reminder of we're talking about children who are small and had little choice in what was happening to them. When I was asked to do this paper, I had some misgivings, he wrote. For if I were to be honest, I must tell you of things as they were. And really, he added, this is not my story, but yours. Now, the story he told to the other Indian Affairs Department officials is a harrowing one of constant abuse and mistreatment. And food was a central part of this abuse and therefore plays a really prominent role in Moses' report. And this is a report, I should add, that was first brought to my attention by his son, John Moses, in which I'm presenting with the family's blessing. The food at the Institute, Moses wrote, was disgraceful. And I'm quoting from his memoir here. For breakfast, students were given 2 slices of bread with either jam or honey as the dressing, oatmeal with worms and cornmeal porridge, which was minimal in quantity and appalling in quality. The beverage, he added, consisted of skim milk, and when one stops to consider that we were milking from 20 to 30 head of purebred Holstein cattle, it seems odd that we did not ever receive whole milk in my 5 years at the Institute, and we never received butter even once. Lunch, it turned out, was no better, and I quote, at the Institute, this consisted of water as a beverage. If you were a senior boy or girl, you received 1/2 slices of dry bread, and the main course consisted of a rotten soup made of scraps of beef and vegetables, some in a state of decay. Children under the grade 5 level, for their part, received 1 slice of dry bread. Incidentally, Moses wrote, we were not Weight Watchers. And finally, for supper, Moses recalled, quote, this consisted of 2 slices of bread and jam and fried potatoes, no meat, a bun baked by the girls, and every other night a piece of cake or possibly an apple in summer months. The diet remained constant. Hunger was never absent, Moses wrote. He estimated that 90% of the children were suffering from some form of malnutrition, and he even recalled, quote, children eating from the swill barrel, picking out soggy bits of food that were intended for the pigs. Now, the Mohawk Institute actually wasn't part of the nutrition experiments I'm going to be discussing today, although it was initially listed on the list of potential schools because of the poor quality of the students' diets. But Moses' account parallels those of students who attended schools where the experiments did take place, namely the Alberni School on Vancouver Island, the Blood and St. Paul schools in southern Alberta, the St. Mary's and Cecilia Jeffrey School in northern Ontario, and finally the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School in Nova Scotia. So take, for instance, the testimony of Ray Silver, a survivor of the Alberni Indian Residential School. Silver told the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada of being reduced to scavenging through garbage in order to get enough to eat. And us kids, Silver told the TRC, we used to sneak from the school. We must have had to walk about a mile, sneak away from the school, sneak over the bridge, and go to that dump and pick up apples. They were half rotten or something. They were no more good to sell, but us kids, we were starving. We'd go there and pick that stuff up, fill up our shirts, and run back across the bridge and go back to school. The stories collected by Mi'kmaq writer and Shubenacadie Residential School survivor Isabel Knockwood about her own and her fellow survivors' experience at the school paint a similar picture of survivors with, quote, vivid memories of constantly being hungry. As Knockwood writes about her own experience at the school between 1936 and 1947, just 1 year before the experiments began, the children were often forced to serve gourmet meals on fancy porcelain dishes to the nuns and priests, while she and other children were instead forced to subsist on, quote, potatoes that were often rotten and rancid meat from enameled tin plates. The extent to which such accounts of hunger are common across the entire map of Canada and throughout most of the history of the residential school system led historian J.R. Miller to remark in 1996 that, quote, we were always hungry could serve as the slogan for any organization of former residential school students. So I think it's important today to begin by stressing that the experiments I'll be discussing were only made possible because malnutrition and hunger were common in residential schools across the country, and not just in the 6 residential schools where these nutrition experiments took place. And as I'll discuss later on, this had a profound impact on both the long-term physical and mental health of residential school survivors. As one survivor wrote to me about their own experience during the 1940s, quote, even today, I still cannot ease my feelings of hunger. Now, as you might imagine, students and parents were not silent in the face of the awful conditions in residential schools. In fact, the archives are filled with letters and petitions from Indigenous parents arguing that their children were hungry and sick because of the poor quality of food being provided in the schools. For most of the first 60 years of the residential school system, these pleas fell on deaf ears. And the result was that the Canadian government proved unwilling to admit that hunger and malnutrition in residential schools was a serious problem until during the 1940s, this man, Federal Nutrition Division Director Lionel Pett, who's also the author of the original version of Canada's Food Guide, he launched a series of investigations of the food service in federally operated facilities like prisons, wartime munitions factories, and Indian residential schools. He sought the assistance of Canadian Red Cross dietitians to help with the residential school nutrition investigations, and almost immediately it became clear that the conditions in schools were extremely troubling. Nearly without exception, and in every part of the country, the food served in the schools failed to meet the government's own stated basic requirements for vitamins, minerals, protein, and even calories. At most schools, children weren't allowed even second helpings, no matter how hungry they were. And so-called protective foods like meat, milk, fruits, and vegetables were a rarity. The inspectors also found that in addition to serving insufficient quantity of food, schools often lacked a trained cooking staff, and many lacked even rudimentary appliances, refrigeration, or basic sanitation practices. Most important, though, was the fact that even where there was an experienced kitchen staff or half-decent equipment, there was rarely sufficient funds to actually purchase nutritious foods. In fact, based on the Nutrition Division's own calculations, the per capita grant provided for food at most schools was often half that required to maintain a balanced and nutritionally adequate diet. So Lionel Pett and others within the Nutrition Division made some early recommendations to improve the training of kitchen staff and the menus being used in residential schools after these surveys were done. But follow-up visits to some of the schools in 1947 showed little or no improvement. And so Pett began planning for a long-term study that he argued would be, quote, designed to investigate certain questions already raised regarding Indians. These questions include things like, what type of food service in residential schools will economically provide the best maintenance of health and carry over desirable food habits to reserve? But also, will foods fortified with vitamins and minerals provide demonstrable results over the course of 5 years? Now, Pett was in the midst of a long-standing fight among nutrition professionals over the usefulness of vitamin supplements and nutritionally fortified foods, many of which at this time were banned in Canada. And so he saw the malnourished children in the schools as a perfect opportunity to provide some scientific data on these contentious questions. At the same time, he also wanted to intervene into debates that began to emerge during this period about the causes of what was then understood to be Canada's quote-unquote Indian problem of susceptibility to disease and so-called dependency. Now, this was a long-standing racist discourse that attempted to explain away health and social effects of Canada's brutal colonial policies towards Indigenous peoples, policies including residential schools, land theft, the pass system, the Indian Act. They wanted to explain these as being the product of so-called racial inferiority. Now, some of Pett's colleagues, though, such as Dr. Percy Moore, who was the head of the newly created Indian Health Services branch, which during this period introduced the racially segregated Indian hospital system, he turned to nutrition as an alternative explanation. As Percy Moore would write in 1942, quote, many characteristics such as shiftlessness, indolence, improvidence, and inertia, so long regarded as inherent or hereditary traits in the Indian race, may at root be really the manifestations of malnutrition. So Lionel Pett sought to test this hypothesis by examining the adaptability of Indigenous diets that were, in his words, quote, caught in a transition state between the fully adequate native diet and an adequate white man's diet. Pett managed to gain the support of both the Department of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services for his proposal, and in the fall of 1948 began a series of experiments that incorporated, among other things, medical and dental examinations, blood tests, intelligence and aptitude tests, as well as the collection of menus and dietary records from each of the schools. So these experiments included, for instance, an examination of the impact of something called Newfoundland flour, which is essentially a flour fortified with artificial vitamins, minerals, and ground bone meal at the St. Mary's School. At the Shubenacadie School, they actually conducted a double-blind randomized experiment examining the effects of nutrition supplements on children showing clinical signs of vitamin C deficiencies, which meant some of the kids got vitamin C supplements, other kids got placebos, meaning no vitamin C. Other experiments included an examination of the effects of both inadequate and adequate milk consumption on a population of children with clinical signs of riboflavin deficiency at the Alberni School, an examination of the effects of something called Canada-approved vitamin B flour at the Blood School, as well as an experiment looking at the impact of a combination of intensive nutrition education, as well as the provision of optional servings of whole wheat bread at the Cecilia Jeffrey School. The St. Paul School in Cardston, Alberta, however, was chosen as a quote-unquote control school, meaning that no changes were made to its menu during the course of the study, despite the fact that the food served was found to be deficient in the supply of a whole range of vitamins and minerals. Now, maybe on the surface, it seemed like these studies involved at least some therapeutic value for the kids. But it's also important to note that none of the experiments actually address the broader range of nutritional deficiencies assessed at each school. Instead, they focused on much more narrow, technologically based interventions that could be applied to the problem of malnutrition, both on reserves and in residential schools alike. And in fact, in some of the cases, the researchers actively withheld certain treatments from the students. So for instance, when one of the lead researchers on the study, Dr. H.K. Brown, he discovered that Indian Health Services dentists had visited some of the students. And so he quickly sent off telegrams and letters insisting that for the duration of the study, quote, no specialized overall type of dental service should be provided to the students, such as the use of sodium fluoride, because cavities and gingivitis were both important factors in assessing nutritional status. So the idea was that any significant dental interventions would interfere with the results of the study. Now, while I did this research, I kept trying to figure out whether the researchers really believed they were helping these children or were acting in an ethical manner. And I never really did find any letters or correspondence about this. But when Lionel Pett was interviewed in May 2000 about the fact that dental treatments were withheld from residential school students as part of his research, he tried to distinguish between his experiment, which he saw as ethical, and one that would be considered unethical by arguing that it was, quote, not a deliberate attempt to leave children to develop cavities except for a limited time or place or purpose, and only then to study the effects of vitamin C or fluoride. So for Pett, in other words, the fact that children were already suffering from the effects of inadequate diets prior to the experiments meant that to his mind, it was ethical to use the children as experimental subjects. But regardless of whether these studies met ethical standards at the time, which I would argue is very debatable, it's clear that they did little to address the widely recognized cause of malnutrition identified in residential schools, which always boiled down to a lack of proper funding for food service, as well as every other aspect of the residential schools. It also seems clear that the students had no idea they were taking part in an experiment, and that for some, the regular physical examinations administered by the researchers could often be confusing, painful, and for some maybe even traumatic. Now, the voice of children is often silent in the documentary record in the archives, but a series of letters sent to Lionel Pett by the pupils of the Alberni Residential School in 1952 provides some insight into their experiences. So these letters were ostensibly being sent by the students to thank Lionel Pett and the researchers for their visits to the school. But it became clear when I was reading the letters from the content and the similar format of each letter that Pett had actually asked the teacher specifically to have the students provide a list of all the foods that weren't available in residential school, but that they were looking forward to eating when they got home. And this was part of a larger study Pett was conducting at the same time as the nutrition experiments that sought to figure out the long-term effects of the residential school experience on children's eating habits once they left schools. And the idea was that they could do whatever they could to change children's eating habits once they got home. Now, the letters, like the letter here from the students at the Alberni School, listed a broad range of both store-bought and country foods that the kids were looking forward to. And so they often included items like homemade bread, fish eggs, duck soup, seaweed, seagull eggs, herring, cherries, pie. But as well as these lists, most of the students also took the time to include other messages to the research team. So these range from simple statements like, quote, thank you for the medical you gave us, to the perhaps more ominous, quote, tell the nurse I said thank you for all the pokes she gave me. Many of the children, for instance, complained that the nurses wrote down the wrong age on their charts, and they were upset that they wouldn't change them. One child who complained of having the wrong age recorded also added that, quote, she didn't understand the words that Dr. Brown was saying. I was listening very carefully, too. An even more common and troubling theme of the letters was that many of the children wanted to reassure the doctors that the examinations and tests were not painful. One child, for instance, wrote, quote, the pokes that I got didn't hurt me very much, and I got a couple of my teeth out by the dentist, but it didn't hurt very much when he pulled them out. And this statement in particular is really telling because according to survivors from Alberni I've spoken to, they were pulling teeth out without anesthetic, right? And so the statement that when I got my teeth out, it didn't hurt is a particularly telling one. Another student wrote, quote, thank you for all the pricks you gave us. I hope we're going to be healthy all through the year and not take so many teeth out. We will all try not to get sick. Now, the fear involved in all of this and the interaction between doctors and students was perhaps best captured by the student who wrote in the letter that I have here, quote, when the nurse pricked me, it did not hurt at all, but a little part is showing yet. I hope I'm okay. Perhaps tellingly, the same student's letter also included a correction that appears to have been added afterwards, in which the student's statement thanking the doctors and nurses, quote, for what they have done to us all, was changed to, quote, for what they have done for us. While many of the students thanked the researchers for coming quote, coming here to help us be well and strong and healthy. It was pretty clear by the end of the study that its benefits were disproportionately skewed towards the professional interests of Lionel Pett and the other researchers. And in fact, for the children who acted as controls during the study, whose diets weren't improved, or like the students at the St. Mary's School in Kenora who actually developed iron deficiency anemia during the course of the study, likely as a result of the bone meal in the experimental flour they were given, the risks to their own health often far outweighed any possible benefits they might have received. In fact, what's more, the fact that the researchers knew that overall improvements to students' health were impossible without a substantial increase to the per capita funding to schools really highlights the stark reality that these experiments were only made possible in the first place because of an intentionally underfunded residential school system that was always, from the very start, characterized by the neglect and abuse of students. And the reality was none of these experiments or studies had much in the way of even scientific value. Some of the data collected from the experiments was presented at conferences or workshops or published in very minor journals, but it had little effect on either the science of nutrition or the operation of food services in residential schools. In fact, reports continued to come in regarding the poor food service in schools not included in these experiments. In 1953, for instance, Indian Health Services reported or received reports from carpenters working on the Brandon Residential School in Manitoba that the children, quote, are not being fed properly to the extent that they're garbaging around in barns for food that should only be fed to barn occupants. And nearly a decade of experiments and studies of Indigenous diets appears to have similarly done little to alter pre-existing assumptions held by federal policymakers and bureaucrats. They continue to push for expert-driven technological solutions as a means of easing the so-called transition to quote-unquote modern diets. And in many ways, these attitudes fit within the broader shared value system that characterized Canada's administration of Indigenous peoples during this period. The 1950s, for instance, saw the Department of Northern Affairs and Natural Resources attempt to socially engineer a solution to the so-called quote-unquote Eskimo problem by experimentally relocating a number of Inuit communities without their informed consent to unfamiliar and often unforgiving new high Arctic settlements. And this has been well documented. The result was not only profound social and cultural dislocation that continues to this day, but in the tragic case of the Haramut of Venendai Lake, the result was also hunger, starvation, and misery. Now, the decision to engage in these kinds of brazen attempts at social engineering ultimately came from a common mindset within the federal bureaucracy. As Northern Affairs Executive Officer Robert Phillips wrote in 1955, it was useful for the department to, quote, think of 9,000 Eskimos as a laboratory experiment and give the imagination full rein on what might be done to improve the culture. So Indigenous peoples, in other words, continued to be seen as experimental subjects and their communities as laboratories for both scientific and social experimentation well after these nutrition experiments ended. Now, I often get asked about the legacies of these experiments, and they were really multiple. For survivors, learning that they were part of an experiment seems to have confirmed what they long believed about their own experience. As survivor Leonard Pootlas told the Toronto Star, he was alarmed by revelations he'd been part of a nutrition experiment, but not surprised. They never treated us as human beings, Pootlas told the Star. Even to this day, I'm 67, I'm still haunted by it. The late Alvin Dixon, a survivor of the Alberni Residential School, expressed a similar sentiment on CBC's As It Happens, stating that these revelations were not a surprise and that they'd simply affirmed what he always believed. That, quote, the federal government and most Canadians don't give a shit what happens to us as First Nations peoples. They're on our stolen lands, our holy lands. They're not going to be happy until they have it all. They were trying to eliminate us, so that's not surprising. Now, these are sentiments I've heard echoed by other survivors from around the country who I met with since first publishing this research. Whether it was in private correspondence or at public events organized by communities directly affected by the experiments, many survivors have told me that their experience of residential school was one of abuse, neglect, and near constant hunger in the face of inadequate and often even inedible food. Others testified about experiencing a whole range of unexplained but clearly traumatic medical and dental procedures. And in fact, since I began presenting my research to communities affected by these experiments, I've tried to devote much of my scholarly work to answering questions posed by residential school survivors and their families. So when I presented my research to a gathering of survivors on the site of the former Alberni residential school, for instance, I was asked many times about whether traumatic experiences at the hands of dentists in particular, including the extraction of whole rows of bottom or top teeth without anesthetic, I was asked whether these were part of some kind of experiment. But then when I began to hear similar stories from survivors as far away as Ontario and Nova Scotia, I turned to my friend and colleague, Dr. Catherine Carstairs, who was in the middle of writing a book on the history of dentistry in Canada. Now, what we uncovered when we began looking into the archives weren't actually medical experiments, but evidence of the ways in which the constant drive to limit government spending, both in residential schools and on reserve, meant that the oral healthcare provided to children and adults alike tended to be rushed, inadequate, inconsistent, and sometimes even cruel. So procedures like providing fillings, for instance, were deemed too expensive. So dentists relied overwhelmingly on extractions. And because dentists were not allotted sufficient time or resources to provide adequate care to schools or communities, their work tended to be rushed, leaving no time for using anesthetic, which regardless was often deemed an unnecessary budget item. And even basic oral healthcare hygiene was restricted by the department's unwillingness to pay for things like toothbrushes in residential schools. So when residential school administrators in BC, for instance, requested funds to provide students with 2 toothbrushes per year in 1958, Percy Moore, the head of the Indian Health Service, refused on the grounds that it was too expensive and, quote, would be creating a precedent that would be difficult to control. Buying toothbrushes for kids would create a precedent. So it's decisions like these, when combined with the poor quality of food provided to students, they created a vicious cycle of cavities and extractions for generations of survivors. And this cruel treatment, in other words, saw thousands of Indigenous people lose teeth that could easily have been saved with fillings. And it was only exacerbated by the Department of Indian Affairs' long-standing refusal to provide dentures. And the long-term health and social impacts of this refusal are staggering. Generations of individuals were unable to properly eat a full range of healthy foods due to problems chewing, and both their self-esteem and ability to join the workforce was severely affected by their appearance, as losing large numbers of teeth, as many of you know, will change the shape of your face. Perhaps most devastatingly, it also meant that generations of Indigenous peoples continue to, and rightfully I would argue, distrust dentists and other dental health professionals. And this has played a key role in producing the epidemic of poor oral health among Indigenous peoples today, which is much, much worse than the rest of the population. So the cruel treatment from dentists that survivors of the nutrition experiments described to me, in other words, was intimately connected to the policies that led to the widespread hunger and malnutrition in residential schools in the first place, namely the chronic and intentional underfunding of both residential schools and healthcare services by the federal government. Which leads me to perhaps the most common question I received when I presented my research to survivors from coast to coast. What were the health impacts of these experiments in particular, not just on survivors, but on their children and on their grandchildren? And from early on, I always answered that it was the malnutrition and not any of the specific experiments that would have had the most serious impact on people's health. But this was never really a satisfying answer for anyone, and so I attempted to find a better answer. In doing so, then I started the research collaboration I talked about earlier with Dr. Tracy Galloway. And our goal really was to focus specifically on the long-term effects of the type of malnutrition and hunger that made these experiments possible in the first place. And to that end, we've since co-authored 2 research articles on the topic, one of which was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2017. And I do think it's safe to say that Tracy and I were both shocked and surprised by what we found. So starting with both the archival materials and survivor testimony I've been discussing today, we attempted to put together a picture of the nutritional deficiencies in a typical residential school diet, particularly before the mid-1950s, before a series of key reforms were put in place. So for the majority of the residential school system, then, these were diets that we found were characterized by insufficient caloric intake, minimal protein and fat, severely limited access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and frequent bouts of foodborne infection. So for example, according to Tracy's calculations, A generous interpretation of the account from Russell Moses that I read earlier would have been a diet that delivered a maximum of about 1,260 calories today, with diets for students more generally averaging between 1,000 and 1,400 calories a day before the mid-1950s. Which is in contrast, I should add, with the caloric requirements for moderately active, healthy children ages 4 to 18 years, which tend to range between 1,400 and 3,200 calories per day. And this doesn't even take into account the fact that these were kids who were doing, spending upwards of 50% of the time on any given day doing hard physical labor on the residential school farms connected with the schools. So what we quickly realized is the conditions like those described by Moses and other survivors are probably most analogous not just to contemporary high poverty environments in the developing world, but also major famine events that occurred during the 20th century in places like the Netherlands during World War II or China during the early 1950s, and that are the basis for much of our contemporary knowledge about the long-term impacts of sustained malnutrition during childhood, which, as you might imagine, is a really disturbing thought. Now, based on this research, we found the most evident of the health impacts experienced by residential school survivors would have been stunted growth. Now, the effect of malnutrition on an individual's stature is often pronounced. Child survivors of comparable 20th century famines, for instance, are height stunted by an average of 1 to 3 centimeters compared to their peers who didn't experience famines. And this level of stunting has been shown to have pronounced effects. So height-stunted youth, for instance, tend to show greater insulin sensitivity and lower insulin levels, making them much more prone to developing type 2 diabetes. The bodies of height-stunted children also tend to experience greater fat mass accumulation when nutritional resources do become available later in life, with significant impact on an individual's long-term risk of obesity. But what's more, the effects of childhood undernutrition would not have been limited to survivors themselves. Growth-stunted women, for instance, are at higher risk of problem births and miscarriages. Children born to women whose obesity and diabetes arose through childhood undernutrition are also more likely to experience a range of health problems. These include having an either high or low birth weight, as well as being more likely to develop insulin resistance and diabetes as children, youth, and young adults. And in some cases, these effects aren't limited to the second generation. Studies have shown that these developmental consequences of hunger, like elevated body mass index and risk of obesity, can be carried on in the adult grandchildren of survivors of prolonged childhood undernutrition. So hunger, in other words, had intergenerational impacts on survivors and their families. Now, all of this together then describes a pattern of sustained exposure to caloric restriction that produces a biological complex of height stunting together with metabolic changes that lead to greater risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and a whole range of other chronic diseases. And in fact, many of these chronic diseases are precisely the ones that disproportionately impact Indigenous communities in Canada today. And I think this points to one of the most important implications of our research. Well, much of the efforts, official efforts on Canada's part to combat obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related chronic disease risks in Indigenous communities, they've often focused on modifying individual behavior and on education. But there's been less recognition that these health problems may, in fact, be another legacy of the residential school system. And perhaps what's just as devastating is the fact that the schools attempted also to forcibly strip multiple generations of children of their food cultures and traditions. So rather than learning essential skills of how to properly harvest, prepare, and eat healthy, seasonal, and sacred foods, many survivors of the residential school system were taught to reject the foodways of their communities in favor of a heavily starch-based and really unhealthy diet that they were provided in the schools. In fact, many survivors from around the country have told me it wasn't just that they're forced to consume unfamiliar and often inedible food. Food also became a key source of reward and punishment in the schools. A Shubenacadie survivor, Alice Paul, told Isabel Knockwood, for instance, quote, "One day when some kid made a mistake and threw some potato peelings in the milk can, we were all punished until that person confessed. We had no meals for 2 days." Another Shubenacadie survivor, Doug Knockwood, recalled a nun grabbing him by the hair, tilting his head back, and force-feeding him until he vomited when he refused to eat a meal after another child had spilled the contents of an entire salt shaker onto his plate. Now, a legacy of these kinds of horrifically common acts, according to some children of the residential schools survivors I've spoken with, are generations of adults who have struggled to overcome the psychological burden of these experiences. The memories of these hard, hungry years has led for many to a fixation on food, as well as a tendency towards overeating and a fear of food waste. And this is a common experience, I should add, of famine survivors the world over. And these, as you all know, aren't the only impacts that nutrition experiments had on survivors. The fact that many had argued that they were being experimented on for decades prior to the publication of my and other research led to considerable fear and anxiety. And for many, it led to a lifelong distrust of doctors and other medical practitioners. Now, these are much harder health impacts to measure, but they had real effects on people's lives. And in fact, many survivors I've spoken to remained hesitant to vaccinate themselves and their children, for instance. And this is something that has had particularly disturbing implications during our current pandemic. And it's something that I also wrote about with my colleague, Dr. Jairus Swidrovich, who teaches at the School of Pharmacy at U of T. And as you can see here, was also published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Which brings me perhaps to, the final question, which is the question of reconciliation, right? What does it mean to reconcile with the legacy of a residential school system whose intent, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, was nothing short of an attempted genocide? And what does it mean when we begin to fully understand that not only were children treated like guinea pigs in medical experiments conducted by the federal government itself, but that hunger and malnutrition, which made these experiments possible in the first place, likely had profound and devastating effects on the long-term health and well-being of both survivors and their families. No amount of compensation can make up for this legacy of pain and suffering. And in fact, hunger and malnutrition, as many of you likely know, were never included on the list of harms eligible for additional compensation under the residential schools settlement agreement. In fact, nor was medical experimentation. Yet nearly 7 years after the TRC first released its 94 calls to action, my colleague Eva Jewell and I at Toronto Metropolitan University have calculated that only 11 of the 94 calls to action have been completed to date. A shockingly low number. And I think, as my presentation today suggests, implementing the TRC's calls to action is really the bare minimum that non-Indigenous Canadians like myself can do. After all, overcoming the legacy of residential schools means first acknowledging the truth of Canada's responsibilities for the ongoing health crises in Indigenous communities, and then acknowledging the impossibility of dealing with these intergenerational harms in communities with no clean water, with inadequate health and educational service, and who are forced again and again to go to courts to fight for basic rights that all other Canadians take for granted. So reconciliation, I'd argue, is meaningless without action, and I hope some of the research I presented today will encourage any other settlers listening in to take action and to demand that Canada lives up to its promises to implement the TRC's calls to action, and in doing so, takes the first and essential steps towards taking responsibility for a legacy of genocide. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.